world, but it wasn't in vain. As a humanity, we will fight to bring justice for you, Ali, and every drop of blood you shed. So I want to thank you on behalf of the South African Jews for a Free Palestine. Thank you for inviting us to speak today. It is an honor and an inspiration and a little bit overwhelming to be amongst everyone and the organizing efforts today. I'm also a historian, and I was asked to speak about anti-imperialism, which is one of my favorite topics, so I hope you're all ready for a history class. It's common to hear people say that history repeats itself, but history does not repeat itself. People repeat themselves, which is why a focus on anti-imperialism is so important in taking the struggle for Palestinian liberation forward. SAJFP is a group of anti-Zionist Jews drawing on our understanding of the responsibilities of Jews to stand up for justice, including for the total liberation of the Palestinian people. We are here today to stand in solidarity with Palestine against the brutalities of Israel backed by the U.S. and by Zionists worldwide. We're living in the wake of unresolved and ongoing histories of imperialism. This year marks the 140th anniversary of the Berlin Conference, where European powers sat down to carve up the continent of Africa. It was also that same time, between the 1880s and 1914, that the families of most South African Jews, mine included, arrived as refugees fleeing pogroms and genocides in Eastern Europe. What we know about and how we frame these histories will determine what we think we need to do about it today. And what we do about it today will determine who lives and who dies many miles from here in occupied Palestine. Imperialism is defined as a policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force, or by other means. Imperialism is about dominance, control, enclosure, policing, extraction, and the reproduction of wealth across imposed and controlled borders. It's a process of alliance building, proxy wars, and geopolitics. It is about power over and not power with, which are two very different things. The vocab may change from imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, neoliberalism, but the fundamentals remain: to set the rules of the game of securing power and extracting wealth to win over and over again. The histories of imperial victories, which are always insecure because they always serve a minority at the expense and exploitation of the majority, are written by the victors. They always portray this expansion as earned, deserved, inevitable, and inalienable. And they are always painting themselves as best suited to care for and lead, giving very real benefits of survival and comfort for complicity, and harsh punishment for refusal. As we have seen over the past few days, the narrative of colonial occupation, especially settler colonial occupation, require constant expansion and defense in the face of anti-colonial resistance. Like many Jews before us, the South African Jews for a Free Palestine reject the Zionist idea that Jewish safety requires a Jewish homeland, and that Judaism justifies the state of Israel and its abominable treatment of Palestinians. Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism predicated on the establishment of a Jewish-only state on Palestinian land. As SAJFP, we see Zionism as racism, with the inevitable oppression of first-class citizens over second-class citizens. Zionism is what drives the Israeli government's system of apartheid and dispossession of Palestinians now and for the last 75 years. The establishment and ongoing defense of Israel and its arrogant, entitled settler behaviors rests to a large part on the framing of the Holocaust. SAJFP rejects the ways that Jewish trauma has been weaponized to justify the occupation and oppression of Palestine. This framework, where victimhood justifies all subsequent behavior, goes against the core ethics of Judaism. As spelled out in her new book, anti-Zionist Jewish political writer Naomi Klein unpacks how the horrific genocide of the Holocaust has been given special status that justifies colonial occupation and all the brutality that it entails as a twisted form of reparations. It's important to see that the Nazis and their racist eugenics were a continuum of European settler colonial projects that shaped the world we continue to reckon with. Hitler himself said that the idea of concentration camps came from the British and the South Africans. The Germans' first practices of genocide were right here in Namibia, where in response to resisting the dispossession of land, they exterminated tens of thousands of Nama and Herero people. These practices were then imported back to Europe. Aimé Césaire, the Martinican anti-colonial poet and politician, argued that the Holocaust was colonialism turned inwards. Likewise, at that time, political theorist Hannah Arendt, herself a Jewish critic of Zionism, argued that colonial racism of imperial expansion set the stage for the Holocaust. Klein points out how framing the British and Americans as the good guys who defeated Hitler and freed the Jewish victims has been used to dismiss their imperial legacies, which they continue to defend today. If the Holocaust is rooted in unethical European colonial politics, then that is what we need to address now. As poet Mohammed El-Kurd's refrain in a poem called Who Lives in Sheikh Jarrah goes, colonialism in Jerusalem killed the peace. But instead, the argument many Zionists were making at the end of World War II was that Jews earned the right to an exception to the decolonial consensus, an exception born of their recent near extermination, victimization, and vulnerability. And so the argument was that if Europe could establish nations based on ethnic cleansing and massive colonial violence and land theft, then it is discrimination to say that Israel cannot. And so it was framed as anti-Semitism to restrict Israel. The quest for equality was therefore framed not as the right to be free, but as the right to take land and colonize, which of course suits the Western powers. As SAJFP, we reject this narrative and the colonial dynamics it justifies. The US and Israel continue to frame themselves as saviors of the Jews, and we saw that at the ICJ hearings yesterday, where Israel is currently spinning itself as the victim and leaning hard on a twisted, capitalist, colonizing version of safety. We reject this. To transcend the trauma of the Holocaust and many horrific and life-defining experiences of anti-Semitism before and since that time, we need to challenge the way that our fear is weaponized to justify atrocities and keep us complicit in a global power dynamic. Attempts to defend Israel are attempts to defend an entire world order based on the idea that there can be bubbles of security without peace. As Klein points out, it's not just Israel that wants peace without justice and bubbles of security by fortressing borders. I think we must name this world order as one of racial capitalism, and we must unapologetically call for a decolonization from seaports to the Red Sea. History shows us that colonial promises of security are in Israel and everywhere promises of violence. As Devin Atala wrote in a beautiful piece recently called Beyond Grief, As our Palestinian people face the genocidal unmasking of the colonial world, we know that when colonizers talk of security, they are in fact talking about violence. In the colonial exchange, security becomes violence, and violence becomes security. They merge and become the same word. For decades, Israel has operated on the pretense that it can provide security for its citizens while subjugating the Palestinian people to an apartheid regime. Now that pretense has been shattered. Did Israel lie or mislead its citizens for over 7 decades? Yes. Well, the answer is one of semantics. Israel's promise that it would provide security for its citizens has always, in fact, been a promise that it would provide them with violence. As SAJFP, we know that anti-Semitism is real, but the move to conflate anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is to cover up the racist roots of Zionism and its foundational idea that we need a Jewish homeland to be safe. This form of safety through oppression, in our opinion, is a breeding ground for anti-Semitism. We are not the first to say this. It was pointed out by our anti-Zionist Jewish ancestors throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Most Jews in Germany in the 1930s, for example, opposed Zionism. There was no consensus. Capitulation was contested at every turn. So let us remember that at the end of World War II, it was Zionist Jews in the West, in Europe, and in the US who lobbied for quotas of limiting the number of Jewish immigration out of Nazi German concentration camps to come to the West. The rest would rather be sponsored to go to Palestine, a place that most Jews in the US, for example, did not want to go, but wanted as a backup plan in the face of anti-Semitism and insurance policy that they would contribute towards sponsoring. What is important here is to show that many Jews living in Israel today had few choices, and most there today do not have financial means of leaving. They are pawns of the powerful who we know always look out for themselves and spin it as benevolent, paternalistic saviors. As South Africans, we know that to impose a homeland, an ethno-nationalist space for only one kind of people, as if people are ever only one pure thing and belong in one place, is disastrous. We know about the myths of colonial protection and care, about truth without justice, about empty rainbows, about reconciliation without reparation or return. Yesterday we heard Israel try to claim that the evacuation of Palestinians was to keep them safe. We know this is part of their settler colonial plan of expansion, which requires further and further dispossession. Already since the 7th of October, over 85% of people in Gaza have been evacuated as mass forced displacement from over 355,000 homes. This is not an innocent side product of a so-called conflict with Hamas. This is disaster capitalism. In fact, we've already seen pre-sales of beachside property homes for sale to Israelis imagined in adverts along the Gaza Strip. History does not repeat itself, people do. In response to the ICJ hearings yesterday, South Africa's Chief Rabbi Warren Goldstein suggested that Israel is above the UN, which he said is a threat to freedom and democracy in the world, the UN. This is the ongoing history of colonial denialism and justification for an exclusive, securitized form of safety for a few at the expense of the rest. Goldstein says he speaks on behalf of the South African Jewish community, and we say, not in our name. We know there are options of other Jewish voices, opinions, and actions throughout history that we can draw upon for inspiration and for clear direction today. For example, before the Holocaust, our Jewish ancestors organized the Jewish Socialist Labor Bund in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, where the majority of South African Jews come from. They believed in a principle called doikat, or kierness. They argued that we should build communities of solidarity in the places that we worked and in the places that we live right now, not in some faraway future space. This idea of home beyond a nation state, and where we find common ground and bonds of mutual care with other communities that we live, was their anti-capitalist alternative. To fight for justice where we are, and with and for people who we are and are not related to us. Because our safety is a mere illusion if it relies on walls and weapons to keep those we dehumanize out. In the famous words of Marek Edelman, he was a Jewish partisan leader who survived the Warsaw Ghetto. He said to be a Jew means always being with the oppressed and never the oppressor. This is what will keep us safe. When we say to our Passover singers, no one is free until everyone is free, we need to match these sentiments to action. Long-term, slow action, immediate daily action that reconfigure the colonial dynamics we inherit and challenge the ongoing brutality and growth of imperial power. Imperialism is driven by capitalist expansion, and capitalism is based on racism. So if we want to talk about anti-imperialism, we need to talk about anti-capitalism, anti-Zionism, and anti-racism, where we are in and across national borders. This, for SAJFP, is part of the core mandate work outlined in Judaism known as Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world. This is why, for example, Jews do not believe that the Messiah has yet come. It is because our teachings say that first humans will have to do the work of social justice, and then the Messiah will come, and we will enter a post-emancipated state of emanation called Atzilut. As anti-Zionist Jews, we believe in building a Judaism beyond Zionism and a world free of colonialism and white supremacy. There is no peace without liberation. This is hard work. It is complicated, relentless work. As racist, patriarchal capitalism remains the order of the day, with the U.S. assuming the world as its playground, wanting control, ideally by proxy, or indirect rule, or even better, by just extracting our resources and having us buy them back as consumer capitalists. There is much we can do to refuse, to redistribute, to repair, to reckon and rebuild. This is the only way to be safe. History does not repeat itself, people do. Migration has been here forever, but borders are new. An anti-imperialist position demands that we answer this burning and last question I will leave you with. Can we arrive and make, not take home? Can we make, not take our home? This is our challenge to Jews in Palestine and to Jews in South Africa. We are grateful to be here in alliance with all of you to live out these answers and see that from Sea Point to the Red Sea, Palestine will be free.